Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Tetsu here, and this is going to be video number 3 from the Typological Analysis series. And the topic of today's video is going to be what is personality type. So we're going to try and define personality type, and we're going to introduce the terms we need to do that, and we're going to look at some concepts related to that as well. As you see, I've switched to the whiteboard since I think it's a better way to introduce the concepts we want to tackle here. And we can start now. So imagine this is you, okay? And we can also fix a point in time. So let's say 12 o'clock. So this is going to be you at 12 o'clock. What we're looking at here is a snapshot in time of you. And we can try and think about what can be happening here. So in this moment, one thing that can be happening is that you're having some thoughts, right? Some thoughts arriving at your consciousness. You're thinking about what happened yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow, how you're going to tackle the problems you have in your life. And all of those things we can classify as thoughts. So this is one thing that can be happening. But now I mentioned that while you're thinking those thoughts, suddenly you hear this loud noise outside, loud honking, like someone is honking. And usually what's going to happen is that you're going to snap out of this thinking process and you're going to be more aware of your current environment. So your senses are going to arise. And what you're going to do is probably go next to the window and go and check what is this source of noise outside, is there danger, you're going to evaluate the situation, but it's mostly using your senses, right? You're going to see the situation, you're going to hear what is going on. It's kind of a different thing than thinking the thoughts. So we can label this as, let's say for now, sensing. So this is another option. Now, another thing you can do is you can be experiencing some kind of an emotion, right? You can be trying to process emotions. Let's say you're heartbroken, and this emotional pain that you feel is going to be quite different than those two things. Although those processes are very different, but at the same time, during your experience, you do not notice that so much because the transition between the processes is very fluid. Okay, so we can say that feeling, let's call this feeling, is another option as a process that you can experience. And what we can call all of these things, so all of those things, you can call your experience. Okay, so this is your experience in the current moment. Now, what we're interested in is explaining this experience as accurately as we can, and not just we, but everyone who's ever done, who's ever worked in psychology is interested in explaining the experience of people. And now let's try and think about what can affect this experience. So we're trying to analyze the experience in and of itself. I also have my notes here, so let me check if I didn't miss anything. Yeah, so what we want to do is find a framework, a model, which represents this kind of diagram and explains it in some way, like explains your experience. Okay, now let's try to see which are the factors that are relevant for your experience and analyze this a bit. So we can leave this at the top here just to remind ourselves if we need it again. So this is the person who is having an experience. He can be thinking, sensing, or feeling, or some other process. Right? And now let's draw a timeline. So we're trying to understand this experience, what affects the experience. So let's draw a timeline here. And let's point out that this is the current moment, okay? So this is you at the current moment. You. This is right now. Then we can have this point here, which is when you acquired consciousness. Let's say when you were born, but it's more like when you acquired consciousness. But for now, we'll label this as born. And let's say here is like the beginning of humanity, right? Start of humanity. Of course, obviously not up to scale. But now we can analyze this and try and understand what can affect the experience. So one thing that happens is between the time you were born and when you're right now, there's this time that passed. So let's get this time here. And you can say that in this moment, in this time period, you acquired some memory, which definitely affects your experience. So if you're thinking what happened yesterday, this is a direct link to your memory. So one factor that can affect this is memory, but we need to be careful because I will distinguish between different kinds of memory. So we can call this conscious memory. So conscious memory. And you can see how this can affect you. Another thing that is directly related to your experience is your memory is actually affected by the environment you're in. Like depending on where you were born, you're going to have different kinds of experiences and different kinds of memory. So of course, environment is one very big factor. So if you're born in a first world country, there's very high likelihood that you won't have survivability problems. You're going to be raised like in, let's say, a middle class family, and then most of the stuff you're going to be concerned about is going to be related to self-improvement and figuring out the relationship, your direction in life. While imagine you are born in Africa, in the middle of Africa, where people are actually starving there. So you're going to have completely different experience in the moment based on your environment. So this is another factor that can be very heavily affecting your current experience. Another thing we can look at is actually gender as well. So, oops. So gender. So some people do not believe in gender, they consider it a social construct, but for the purpose of these lectures, we're gonna distinguish gender as a as something that affects your experience. And one way this can affect your experience is, for example, a lot of people think that, which I think is true as well, but if you take a sample size of 1,000 men and 1,000 women, and then look at them through this kind of process analysis, most of the time, what you're going to see is that the women are going to have a preference for the feeling so-called process, and the men are going to be more on the thinking side. So this is obviously in terms of in general, not for a specific person. So there can be a person, a woman that is more focused on thinking and a man that is more focused on feeling, but in general and overall on average, women are going to be more focused on feeling. So this is another way, another factor that can affect your experience. Okay. Another thing that can affect your experience is, you can call this genetic memory. So as I said before, there are multiple types of memories. So we can say genetic memory. And it's really pretty obvious what we mean by that. It's not just when you were born, but also you were a result of two people, and then if you look behind, they were a result of two more people, and you have this whole family tree going back a long time. And a lot of factors coming from the genetics can affect your current experience as well. For example, there are some tribes in Africa where the average height of the person is 180, regardless of if it's a man or woman, for a person of this tribe. And you can see how this is coming from your genetic memory. So race is a very good example of genetic memory restrictions you have in your experience. Okay, and the final thing I want to cover here is actually, you can call it collective memory, but I'll call it just species memory. So this is going to be the things that you get as from being a human. So of course it applies limitations on your experience as well. First, it defines what your senses are in a specific way, so it's directly correlated to what your experience is. At the same time, it applies some restrictions, okay? So you're not able to jump like 10 meters high, you're not able to fly, you have some restrictions based on your species memory. Okay, and now we can actually go back to this image and try to explain how those things affect your experience. Okay. So if we go back here, so we identify those five factors that can affect your experience, but what you notice is that those 5 factors, most of them actually do not work on the structure of your experience. They actually work on the content of your experience. So what I mean by that is that, let's consider your memory, right? You're having thoughts again. And those thoughts, the content of the thoughts can be affected by your environment, your memory, so you can be thinking specific things based on your environment, based on other factors, but the structure in and of itself is kind of a different topic, right? The structure is different than the content. So by the structure, I mean that you're having thoughts, you're having feelings, emotions, you're doing sensing. And those things kind of define the structure of your experience, not the content. And this is what we're trying to find out. We're trying to find out what is the structure that represents your experience. And now we're getting closer to defining actually personality type. So what you can notice, for example, is this is you at 12 o'clock. Then you can pick another point in time. Let's say 14 o'clock. Let's say 1 year from now. And what we can notice is that the structure of your experience, so what you're having here, this thing, it does not change too much. The content might change, but the structure in and of itself is very stable. This is what we are trying to say. So you're always going to use these processes. And now we're going to actually introduce some additional claims about those processes that are going to help us finally define personality type. Okay, so we're going to introduce 4 premises that we're going to claim about this structure, and after we do this claim, we will finally be able to define personality type. Okay, so what are those 4 premises? Why do I call them premises first? It's because in and of itself, they are not obvious at all. It's not obvious that this is true, but still, in my experience, I've been convinced that those are true, and also I'll probably tackle this in later lectures, but for now, just put them as premises. So we're going to put premises that are going to be affecting our experience, and more accurately, the structure of the experience. Okay, just check my notes if I'm missing something. No, so let's introduce the premises. So the first thing we will do is we're going to say that there are 4 natural processes available to you. And the 4 processes are going to be, I'll call them like this, so thinking, The second one is going to be feeling. It's not ordered, so in any order doesn't matter. Then we have sensing. And the fourth one is going to be intuition. Okay? And we haven't talked about intuition. So now, are those the same as what we talked before in terms of your cognitive abilities and like cognitive processes? There's a relation, it's not one-to-one mapping between this and what we talked before. But still, those are the four processes that we are going to define. And now we're going to introduce some premises. So what are the premises? So claim number one is going to be that all people, so I'm going to write it down, number one, all people use the same natural processes. Use the same natural processes. So this is what we're going to call natural processes. Keep in mind I'm not calling them cognitive processes because in my opinion those do not affect just your cognition, they also affect your physiology and they're very integrated, very on a root level to your experience. It's not just cognitive. So we call those natural processes. And claim number one is going to be all people use the same natural processes, meaning that everyone is going to use those four processes from woman, man, doesn't matter. If he's human, he's going to use those four processes. This is going to be premise number one. Okay, premise number two is going to be a very interesting one. And it's going to be that, I'm going to write it down. So premise number two is you have a preference for a specific process. Okay? You have preferences for processes. This is in your experience. So what does that mean? What I'm saying here is that those processes are ordered. They're ordered. In the structure we're looking at, those processes are ordered. So you can be having thinking as a major process, then feeling is a secondary process, sensing is a third, intuition is a fourth, but you can order them in another way. So you can start with feeling, and then second can be sensing, and so forth and so forth. So there is order in the process that you're using in your psychology. This is going to be premise number two. As I said, we're not going to go deep into explaining those. This is just a premise for now. Okay? Then the third premise, just going to delete it because I don't have space. So third premise is that different people might have different preferences. Different people might have different preferences. What this means is that if we put the order again, so let's say this is a different one, this is the first is feeling, then it is intuition, let's say, then we have sensing, and what's left is thinking. So what this premise is saying is that this can be person one and this can be person two, And person 1 and person 2, they're using the same process. Remember, this was one of the premises, but the order in which their processes are being utilized in their psychology, in their life, and everywhere is going to be different. So different people, if they're not the same type, they can have different process which is prioritized. This is number 3. Now, number 4, the final one. Number 4 is going to be that your preference, this is a very important one, all of them are important obviously, your preference stays consistent throughout time. Basically, if you remember the example from before, let's say this was you at point number 1, and then at point number 2, what this is saying is that if you look at 12 o'clock, 14 o'clock, 3 years from now, the preference that you have is gonna be the same regardless of at which point we look at you. Very, very important one. This, in other psychological models, this is not the case. So they're saying that your preference might change. This doesn't mean, by the way, that you're not able to improve. So, for example, if this was your preference, you're going to be able to improve your abilities in specific areas, and your strength of improvement, so how fast you can improve, can depend on what the order is of the natural process you use. So you're not limited. You're not like you're always going to be able to improve, but still the order, your preference order remains the same throughout time, remain consistent. So this is going to be number 4. And now, having all those 4, if we assume those 4 are all true, then we can finally define what is personality type for this model. But what we're going to say is that personality type is going to be, so if this is the structure, right, and these are the 4 processes that you have, regardless what is the order, personality type is going to give a label to this template, this structure that you're using, and since there are different structures for different people, they're going to be named differently. So all personality types is naming this order in which you use the process you use. And we're going to go more deeply into this, but for example, we can look at one type. I'll talk about those notations later, but let's say this is one type. So this type is called ENFJ in MBTI. And we are going to be using MBTI notations from this course since they're most familiar for people. But this is how we're going to define the structure. So this is the structure. The structure represents the natural processes, and the structure follows the 4 rules we just laid out. And we're going to, of course, at next lectures, we're going to look at those types. We're going to define some things. But for this specific video, I think this is going to be it. So thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we're going to try and tackle the question of why personality type is important. And then from video 5 onwards, we're going to try and extrapolate how we derive the natural process, what are the variations, and we're going to introduce more terms there. So thank you for watching. Bye bye.